The first thing that woke me wasn't a sound. It was the feeling that something outside had changed. If you've lived alone on a stretch of land long enough, you start to recognize the difference between normal silence and the kind that feels wrong. That night, the quiet felt heavy. I rolled out of bed and glanced toward the window facing the driveway. At first, I saw nothing but the pale wash of moonlight over the fields. Then the movement. 3 figures stepping through the gate like they belonged there. No headlights, no truck, no hesitation. Just 3 men walking straight toward my house. My stomach tightened in a way that instincts rarely lie about. People don't cross a stranger's property at midnight unless they're lost, or they're here for a reason. And these men didn't look lost. I reached for the shotgun I kept by the door, the wood cool and familiar in my hands. Outside, the silhouettes kept moving closer, slow and deliberate. That's when I knew this wasn't random. Weeks earlier, someone had made it very clear they wanted my land. And apparently, they weren't taking no for an answer. Before any of this happened, life out here was simple. The kind of simple people in cities like to romanticize but rarely understand. The farm had been in my family longer than I'd been alive. My father worked this land until the day his heart gave out. And when he was gone, the responsibility passed quietly to me. No ceremony. Just rows of soil waiting to be tended and fences that still needed fixing. Every morning started the same way, boots on the porch, coffee in hand, the smell of earth warming under the sun. I grew vegetables, raised a few animals, and sold enough produce to keep the place running. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. The land gave back exactly what you put into it, and that kind of fairness is hard to find anywhere else. For years, the only neighbors I had were open fields and the occasional wandering deer. Then the developers arrived. Within a year, a luxury neighborhood stood right beside my property line. Perfect houses, identical lawns, and rules for everything you could imagine. They called it an HOA community. At first, I figured we'd just stay out of each other's way. That changed when Karen became HOA president. Suddenly, my tractors were too loud. My livestock ruined the view. Even the smell of fresh soil became a problem. At first, I thought it was just harmless complaining. I was wrong. Karen first approached me on a warm afternoon while I was repairing a fence near the road. I remember because she stepped out of a spotless SUV wearing shoes that clearly weren't meant for dirt. She looked around my fields the way someone might inspect a messy room that offended them personally. Her smile was polite, but it felt rehearsed. She introduced herself as the president of the HOA next door and said she wanted to discuss an opportunity. According to her, the community had big plans. A luxury resort, a private golf expansion, something that would raise property values and attract wealthy visitors. My farm, she explained, happened to sit right in the center of where they wanted to build. At first, she framed it like a friendly business deal. The HOA would buy my land, compensate me generously, and everyone would benefit. But the longer she talked, the less it sounded like an offer, and the more it sounded like a warning. She said development was going to happen one way or another. She mentioned the attorneys the HOA had already hired. At one point, she even hinted that holding onto the land might become complicated. I told her the same thing my father would have said. The land wasn't for sale. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. For a second, her smile froze like she hadn't expected resistance. Then, it disappeared completely. Within a week, the letters started arriving. Official complaints, legal notices, accusations about property violations I'd never heard of. That's when it became clear. This was never about rules. It was about control. After that first conversation, the pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, piece by piece, the way a storm builds on the horizon before anyone admits it's coming. At first, it was just letters, thick envelopes stamped with legal offices I'd never heard of. Inside were complaints about noise, livestock, property lines, rules that somehow applied to me even though I wasn't part of their HOA. Then the tone changed. The letters started mentioning eminent domain. They hinted that resistance could become expensive, that lawyers had ways of making stubborn people reconsider. Every envelope carried the same message, dressed in a different language: sell the land or regret it. Around the same time, unfamiliar cars began appearing near the road. They'd slow down along my fence line, engines idling while someone inside studied the property like they were measuring it in their head. A few HOA members even wandered close to the gate, pretending they were out for casual walks. One evening, Karen showed up again. She didn't step onto the property this time. She just stood outside the gate, arms folded, watching the fields stretch behind me. "You should really reconsider," she said quietly. "Things can get complicated." That night, I installed cameras around the farm and called a lawyer. Something about the whole situation felt off, like a game being played several moves ahead. Then suddenly, the letters stopped. No complaints, no threats, just silence. And that silence felt far more dangerous than the noise ever did. The alert from my security cameras came just after midnight. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a sharp vibration that cut through the quiet. At first, I thought it might be an animal near the barn. That happens sometimes. Though when I opened the camera feed, the screen showed something very different. 3 men were walking through my gate. They moved with purpose, not hesitation. One of them carried something long wrapped in cloth. Another had what looked like a heavy tool hanging at his side. None of them spoke. They just headed straight toward the cabin like they already knew the layout of the place. My chest tightened. People don't approach a farmhouse at that hour unless they believe nobody can stop them. I grabbed the phone and called the police, keeping my voice low while I gave the address. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way, but I could hear it in her tone. Out here, on the way, could mean minutes I didn't have. By the time I ended the call, the men had reached the porch. I slipped out the back door, moving through the darkness along a path I knew by heart. The grass was damp beneath my boots as I circled the house. From the front window, I heard wood splinter. They were forcing their way inside. That was the moment everything stopped being a threat and became reality. I raised the shotgun and fired a warning shot into the dirt near the porch. The blast tore through the quiet night like thunder. Chaos exploded instantly. The men stumbled back outside, shouting and searching the darkness. One of them spotted me and rushed forward with something raised in his hands. Another pulled a gun, firing wildly toward the trees. I fired again. The sound of sirens began rising in the distance, growing louder with every second. Panic spread across their faces as the lights finally swept across the field. Within moments, deputies surrounded the property. The surviving men dropped their weapons and hit the ground. By the time the sun rose the next morning, my farm looked less like home and more like the center of an investigation. Patrol cars lined the dirt road. Yellow tape stretched across sections of the property, and deputies moved carefully through the grass, documenting everything they could find. Boot prints, broken wood from the door. Shell casings were scattered near the porch. The 3 men who survived the night didn't hold out long. Once questioning began. People who break into someone's property expecting easy money rarely plan for the moment things fall apart. Within hours, their stories started spilling out piece by piece. Names were mentioned, phone numbers, payment arrangements, and then one name surfaced that made the entire situation suddenly make sense. Karen. Detectives traced transfers made through accounts connected to the HOA board. Messages between her and one of the men described the job clearly enough that no one could pretend it was a misunderstanding. The instructions were simple: scare me badly enough that I'd finally sell the land. Or make sure I couldn't refuse anymore. By the end of the week, police cars weren't just outside my farm. They were parked in front of Karen's perfect suburban house too. She and several members of the HOA board were taken into custody. News spread across town faster than any official statement could contain. The same neighborhood that once bragged about order and control suddenly found itself tied to a criminal conspiracy. And just like that, Karen's authority collapsed. Months passed before the courtroom doors finally closed on the whole mess. By then, the story had spread far beyond our town. But inside that quiet courtroom, the reality felt heavier than any headline. Karen sat at the defense table, looking nothing like the confident HOA president who once stood at my gate giving orders. The charges against her were read slowly: conspiracy, solicitation of violence, fraud, criminal intimidation. Each one stacked on top of the next like bricks, building a wall she couldn't climb over. Evidence left little room for argument. The messages, the payments, the men she hired. When the judge spoke, the room went completely still. Karen was sentenced to decades in prison. Several HOA board members were convicted alongside her, their roles in the scheme impossible to deny. Investigators later dissolved the HOA entirely while reviewing its finances and leadership. As for the luxury resort and golf expansion they had planned for my land, the project vanished almost overnight. Turns out, power looks a lot smaller once it finally meets consequences. After the trials ended and the headlines faded, The farm slowly returned to what it had always been. Mornings came back with the same quiet rhythm coffee on the porch, the sun stretching across the fields, the steady work of repairing fences that had been ignored during the chaos. I replanted the rows that season as my father taught me, turning soil that had seen far more trouble than it ever deserved. The land stayed where it belonged, in the family. And every time I drive past that silent HOA office, its boardroom dark and empty, I'm reminded that power only lasts as long as people believe they can use it without consequences. Now I'm curious what you think. After everything that happened, after the threats, the attack, and the courtroom verdict, do you think Karen got what she deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you subscribe to more real HOA drama.